afternoon. South African Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago has announced that the repurchase rate will remain unchanged at 6.5% per annum. Kganyago says this was a unanimous decision by the Monetary Policy Committee. He made the announcement a short while ago in Pretoria.
In the absence of shocks, relative exchange rate stability is expected to continue. Some upside risks to the inflation outlook remain, in particular from fuel, electricity and water prices. The MPC welcomes the sustained moderation in inflation outcomes and the fall in inflation expectations of about 1% since 2016. The committee would like to see inflation expectations also anchored closer to the midpoint of the inflation target range on a sustained basis. Against this backdrop, the MPC unanimously decided to keep the repurchase rate unchanged at 6.5% per annum. Monetary policy actions will continue to focus on anchoring inflation expectations near the midpoint of the inflation target range in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth.
Right, there you have it. The repo rate unchanged at 6.5%. The prime lending rate will remain at 10.25%. So let's have further analysis on the decision of the MPC on the interest rate. And we have Lavan Gopaul, who is Director of Merchant Africa. Lavan, welcome to the program.
Good to see you again, Colin.
All right, so given that everybody got it spot on, the analysts and the MPC, a unanimous decision, how does this affect the South African economy looking at the internal factors?
Firstly, let's say what you mentioned about the economists getting it spot on. Out of a poll of 20 economists, 18 called it as a flatliner in terms of interest rates. And this was a gauge before some of the events that have happened in the past few days. As, of course, you'll remember, we've seen a shockwave in the Middle East with those attacks in Saudi Arabia, which have affected commodity prices. And the fact that these analysts have been calling it as a flatliner maybe looks at a very much bigger picture. It's already no secret that much of the decision today to go flat on interest rates is intertwined with the story related to GDP and related to inflation. We've seen a terrible start in terms of GDP this year, and that just represents growth in the economy. And we have seen maybe a slight uptick in the second quarter, some of this coming from some external stimulus. But overall, the picture is bleak. Our economy is worth about 1.26 trillion rand. Looking forward, the governor says he expects growth for the year 2020 to be in the order of 1.5% and 2021 to be in the order of 1.8%. So indeed a slower growing economy. And to conceptualize this, South Africa is an emerging market. We want to attract investment. We want to have a rapidly growing economy, and that will attract investment. So this slow growth factor maybe is a reflection of the global pullback. And this is why the body of economists, or the poll of economists, called it a flatliner. And of course, the Reserve Bank has analyzed the situation with his team very wisely, going flat on interest rates at this point.
But it wouldn't get one excited about this 1.6 economic outlook, like it's going to grow at that rate, because most of the time it's revised to 0.6%.
So unfortunately, the revisions that we've seen in terms of growth have been very much of a disappointment. Slow growth in our economy has been maybe exacerbated by some of the disaster that we've seen, the days of strike, maybe the xenophobia action. A lot of external factors also hurts our economy's growth. And one of those big factors is the price of fuel. And so this is something that is a large uncertainty. And whilst we have these forecasts, we're always forced to revise it lower when we see a spike in the oil price, or when we see the rand hurting us in terms of its valuation against other currencies. Right now, with the strike that we've seen in Saudi Arabia, you're most likely going to see a spike in the petrol price. what would have been an October drop in petrol at the pump, you're now going to see an increase by at least about 2 or 3 cents.
Given that rate, what does it say when we have to look at how the trade conditions survey indicate that it's not actually advisable to do business in South Africa, given that it's now becoming volatile? You will never know what will happen at a drop of a hat in as far as the consumer behavior is concerned, service delivery protests, and also, as you have alluded to, xenophobic attacks. Although one really needs to call a spade a spade. Yeah. They aren't xenophobic attacks. They are attacks with criminality. And,
sure.
and why do we keep on mentioning this narrative of xenophobic attacks, whereas the market should know the truth? Why is the analysis always about xenophobia, whereas South Africans are saying, we're not xenophobic? Why is the market having a misinterpretation of the situation in South Africa?
Look, it's a good point. So referring to the question in terms of is it going to be a big negative for investments in South Africa? Granted, there's a lot of risk when you invest in South Africa, or for that matter, in any of the emerging markets. However, at this point in time, it's a dangerous place to invest anywhere. There's uncertainty in the UK with Brexit. There's uncertainty in the US and China with the trade war going on. Europe has its own set of problems. So whilst we look at South African issues and we're so close to the news locally, it seems like a very a risky investment. However, in a global picture, there is risk everywhere. I think South Africa still offers a huge investment destination potential. And so this is something that we're able to turn the taps on and attract money into the system. What we have at the moment is very good guidance from the Reserve Bank and good leadership from the governor. We also have a finance minister that has been giving us good direction. So that is a very important tool that investors are going to measure. Yes, there's going to be little bits of sound bites of unrest or looting or whatever happens in a domestic economy, but that doesn't thwart the full gusto of investment into the country.
When you look at the exogenous factors, especially the decision by the Fed to cut on interest rates, how does this decision really impact on emerging markets, especially with South Africa that did not make a move today?
So firstly, I think it was a reckless decision by the Fed to cut interest rates at this juncture. I believe that the Federal Reserve in the US should have gone flat on interest rates in the United States. They have, just the other day, cut interest rates by a further 25 basis points, 0.25%. What this will do is immediately make the dollar look slightly weaker. There's going to be less demand for dollars in relative terms because of the change in interest rates, and they're hoping to stimulate a little bit of trade. Bear in mind that this is within the backdrop of an international trade war that they have with China, and they're also creating an unfair or an uncertain playground with Europe. You have recently seen France coming through with a new tax on technology squarely aimed at the United States. So I believe that the decision by the Fed was wrong to drop interest rates. It will have the short-term impact of weakening their dollar, a short-term impact of maybe stimulating a little bit of trade. Unfortunately, the problems that they have with their economy right now are slight. There are probably some uncertain policy decisions more than anything else, not necessarily pure economic problems.
What do you make out of the current global economic state? Are we having calm before the storm in as far as the looming global recession is concerned?
So yes, there are a number of doom and gloom sayers that say the world economy is ready to shrink. We've seen instances every 10 years or so of pullbacks in the economy, and so 10 years ago you had the big financial crisis, and the years before that, before at the turn of the century, you had problems in emerging markets and an Asian crisis. So many doomsayers believe that it's a melting pot of problems globally. I don't believe that it is problems that are beyond control. So even if you consider the trade war with China and the US, which affects a number of countries, at this stage it's a lot of posturing between them. They make decisions and then they reverse decisions very quickly. And so it makes for an uncertain playing field. When you consider the problems with Brexit, whilst it seems intense, and it's probably the reason the two prime ministers in the UK have had to resign, and you now have the current prime minister, it's not something that can't be resolved. And so these aren't real economic problems that can create disaster. I believe that they are all measures that can be curbed. Within the European Union, they're talking about quantitative easing, something we'd briefly spoken about before your interview. And that is something that shows you that the central banks are doing all that they can to come to the rescue of business and to stimulate global trade.
So we should just not worry about a looming global recession now.
It is really difficult when you consider that almost at any point in time, someone is going to say there's going to be a recession around the corner. And a recession is a technical economic situation which refers to slowdown in growth. Whilst we do have tenuous times globally, it's not necessarily something that immediately spells deep recession or doom and gloom. And it's something that we can overcome.
All right. No, thank you very much for making time.
Thank you.
All right. Unpacking today's news that the Reserve Bank having left the repo rate unchanged. Lavan Gopaul, Director of Merchant Africa, right here on Market Sense. You're watching News Today right here on SABC News. Stay with us.
It's the busiest week at UN headquarters in New York. 193 delegations, heads of state and government, thousands of diplomats, journalists and security personnel.
The candidate of Africa had been elected to lead the 74th session of the General Assembly.
For the annual high-level debate, meetings on universal health coverage, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, financing for development and a climate action summit to rally the world's ambition.
Preventing irreversible climate disruption is the race of our lives and for our lives. It is a race